So I was watching one of the Disney Fairies movies, and the premise of it is very ripe for. It's very symbolic. So basically, these fairies, right? Their lifeblood is pixie dust, which allows them to fly, sort of powers everything in the world. It's a light materialization, I suppose, of what you could think of as spirit or life. And obviously, this is a material object, so it's a little bit further down from spirit itself, but functions in a lot of the same ways in the world. And there's this one, and so how the society works is that there are certain fairies whose vocation is to keep the dust, and they have a lot of rules and procedures that everybody accepts, just because it's the way that it's done. And yeah, it's very regimented, their dealings with this substance that is their source of their life and strength. And the main character of the movie is that one up there's Arena, who is inquisitive, curious, wants to know why things work, wants to experiment, wants to see if more can be done with the dust. It's funny because isn't dust also the name for I didn't finish the movie, but what's it called? Oh dear. The one with the compass and the polar bears. His Dark Materials, I think. Anyway, they also have something called dust that seems sort of similar. And people came from. Now I'm thinking about dust. Like sand grains, there's stuff about dust in for the time being, like how it's made, or dust and sand is made up of all of these different materials and just from everywhere, and it's fascinating when you think about it. Anyhow, there's some quotes from the movie, like this guy who's in charge, her boss basically. He's like, "You're the most inquisitive of the dust keepers because nobody else cares. They just do their routine and don't care to look further." And she's like, "You say that like it's a bad thing?" And he says, "Because we don't work with acorn cups and twigs." So he's comparing her to Tinkerbell, who's the heroine of the whole series, but is very curious and sort of innovates a lot. But he's like, "We don't work with acorn cups and twigs. We work with pixie dust. It's our lifeblood. There's no room for error. We don't tamper with it. That it's too powerful. That's not our job. We're just keepers, and we're forbidden to tamper with it." And the whole dynamic reminds me of a certain attitude toward God, or shall we say, toward the Spirit, because the Holy Spirit is both the closest parallel. If you, from a Trinitarian perspective, the Holy Spirit is the closest parallel to the dust, and also the one that sort of the loosest. You can do the most power. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking about the Trinity because I'm gonna say so many heresies, but I don't really have a strictly Trinitarian view. You know what I mean? The Spirit is the one that people are invoking to and people who have a more strict sort of orthodox and legalistic view, that's the first one to go. It's the marginal one. But yeah, I saw so many parallels between this kind of dynamic and me when I was in my former church environment. The attitude was precisely this, was there's no room for error because God and the sort of forces that we're working with here, it's so serious and so powerful. It's our lifeblood, we should just stay within the lines. For fear of, making a mistake. But no, or it leaves you with a very limited sort of life. And I'm thinking okay, why? Because on one hand you see the character here being very curious and open, and that's something that should be allowed, right? And you have to experiment, but at the same time, he's all he's correct to say that this is their lifeblood, and that if somebody comes in ignorantly and messes with something, it could have huge repercussions. And perhaps the problem is more with the structure of the society itself, or just the system itself as they have it. It seems to be a pretty decadent society already, in the sense that, so if we take pixie dust as the spirit, as life, as God, they don't have a personal touch with life. It's mediated by a lot of strict rules that nobody understands, that everybody just conforms to, the law. So that's already a flawed system. The people who are working with this force don't truly and personally understand it. They're not really integrated with it. You see, there's this sort of barrier and this sort of wall. And so when she does start to experiment and goes too fast and makes mistakes and things go wrong, that's it's the inevitable swing of the pendulum the other way, because there's no flexibility. That's sort of the judgment on the system in the first place, where the people, well, fairies, but people who are interacting with this force are so they're basically ignorant of it and only have to go by arbitrary rules. So she doesn't know what she's doing, so as soon as somebody experiments, it instantly breaks it and swings the other way. That's a fallen state of affairs to begin with. And you think about, I think about what that dust is. Or how people experience it. How people experience God, the spirit, life, the energies in the world. There's it itself, right? With all of its potentialities and true kind of full nature, but then there's the dust as known by, your average one of the workers, known through this sort of veil, of laws. And it's only perceived and interacted with and experienced through that veil of laws and rules and fear. it's like a different entity altogether. And that corresponds to the concept of the world understood as the corruptions of the true world, or like Maya, and sort of a veil in a negative sense, because veil could also be a positive sense, but in a negative sense, veil between reality and us. And again, it all has to do with like the law versus the spirit. So in this world, the law would be just blindly following the arbitrary rules in order to protect, and then the more spiritual way would be, well, it's never fully exemplified in the movie, but it would be more of somebody who understands how the dust works and is not afraid to experiment and knows the boundaries, but not like these arbitrary boundaries, like the actual boundaries. Because the thesis of somebody like, what's his name, Fairy Gary, is that that there's these certain boundaries, and these are the arbitrary set in stone ones, and if you go outside of that even a little bit, everything just goes to chaos instantly like this. But that's only because those boundaries have been there for so long, and it's like become hardened. Yeah. Anyhow, we see Zarina moving toward a more living relationship with this force that powers her world. And again, well, this movie doesn't treat it in at all like a religious or like a personal sense. The pixie dust is a material, and it's basically like any material. There's no religion or mysticism around it. And whether from the authorities or from the innovators. But so how she sort of breaks through into this a more living way of relating to the dust is more of like a scientific way, with having hypotheses and ideas and doing experiments. But it's the same as somebody from within a certain religious tradition or philosophy of life stepping outside of that, or asking questions and pushing boundaries. It's a movement toward life, toward like liberty and being one's own person and making things more personal. And honestly, the science is often associated with a materialism and with cutting off the margins and with just empirical stuff. But as Jonathan Pageau points out, the scientific process itself is really a lot more in tune with God and with life than the process of many religious people, because it's very honest. It's about one's own observations. It allows for adjustment and sort of correction of error, and you try not to have anything arbitrary. And a lot of what I have done in my process of shaping my philosophy and thought has felt a lot like this, like making hypotheses and living that way and seeing what happens. And yeah, you pay the price in blood. It's I'm especially with not only just a physical material that's very powerful, but with one's literal lifeblood, and you're messing with your patterns of thought and your like relationships and your view of God and your worship and attention habits. I mean, it touches everything, and it's very much my own life that is at stake. But so there's recognizing the gravity of what we are doing. But I mean, my life was always at stake. Passing off the responsibility to somebody else is way worse. Yeah, so asking questions, making hypotheses, and stepping out on faith, as they say, and like taking risks. And this is a tangent. This isn't to do with the film, but I was thinking about the dust and how it is sort of a metaphor for or an instantiation of spirit or life. But in this case, it's always treated in sort of an impersonal way, like an inert material, even though it is a sort of very spiritual substance in the sense that it's powerful and subtle and it makes things fly and such. And then you also have stories of like miracles where physical and quite dense and quite it's matter, if you think of spirit up here and matter here, it's very down here, but the rocks cry out or the sea parts or calms as if it were a person. So again, with like, and again, I'm not criticizing the way that the film handles its supernatural substance, but the way that it has again to do with what sort of lenses and paradigms and what veils are you putting up between yourself and reality that really makes a difference in how we experience it. Like, spirit and matter are sort of on a continuum. And it's so much about attitude and perspective. Like, even the most subtle, personal, or spiritual matter, quote unquote, reality can be approached with this kind of killing law, rules, fear, attitude. And you can interact with it that way. I mean, can't really know it, but it appears to work. So I guess that would be like somebody treating like love as, chemicals or an evolutionary impulse or something like that. And even the most dense, as miracles show us, even the most sort of dense matter can be dealt with in a personal and living way. But it's each being's choice. How, with what spirit to interact with spirit. / matter, because it's the same thing. And here I'm getting confused. I'm conflating the law attitude with what she's doing here, like with scientific research and experiment. Or rather with, I'm conflating the law with experiment and close observation. But they're not the same thing. Because you have, yeah, if you're just operating in the spirit of the law, and it's not really a scientifically honest process, even because that process, well, if you're operating in the whole sphere of life and not just in one experiment to find out one thing with the spirit of the law, what happens is you take out huge chunks of reality that are very relevant to the situation. Anyhow, her experimentation. Yeah, so I guess going back to the film, what Serena's doing with dust, with her lifeblood, and the supernatural is akin to both a bold scientific experiment and a bold religious or philosophical proposition or way of living. And what this accomplishes is it's more power, right? And like the boundaries are softened and there's more free choice now. So like the different types of dust she makes gives her the ability to use the different to use other fairies' talents. So that which was in the past something innately born in somebody and you can't change it, is now we can choose. It's able to be sort of put on and off and changed at will. What does that remind me of? That people are very mad about. And of course, this allows for more chaos, as it were. It allows for you could get lost more easily in such a world because you'd have to have a stronger mind and like a stronger heart to know what you want still when there are more choices available. But it's part of the development of the world. But predictably, and especially because given the situation she was in, her early experiments are disastrous. The authorities of the society that she's in say that this is too dangerous and reject her and excommunicate her and cast her out of her community. The stone which the builders rejected and all of that. And so she, with this extra understanding of this power, is then also excommunicated from like her home and community. And so she makes like an alternative tree and an alternative source of dust for these pirates who actually appreciate what she's doing. We appreciate what she can do, treasure it actually. This was reminding me of like when they started making, like there was the temple at Jerusalem, but then they started making like other temples that are more convenient and alternatives. But it makes a lot of sense. I mean, what else is she gonna do? Being cut off from her community, she becomes part of a sort of a smaller self that's more of like a stealing and a smaller self that's not the full fullest use of the dust. What would that be like? Well, anyway, the point is that she does. She's left vulnerable, and yet with great power, and is taken advantage of, and has to escape from that situation, which is just the rest of the film. But yeah, thinking about subverting, because the pixie dust is good, right? And it's a source of life and power, but also, as seen here, can be subverted and used for ends that are less than its full potential. So, like, I was thinking of how does that work? How does stuff get polluted or subverted? Well, this again is a very material sort of materialization of life or of spirit. So, you physically take it, remove it, and you use it to power something else. And of course, when the central, or when a community does that and doesn't have a healthy relationship with its source in the first place, and then kicks people out, then of course that stuff's going to start happening way more. If they had been able to integrate her innovations, then this whole conflict would not have happened. But a more spiritual kind of manifestation of spirit, like, say, a doctrine of God, it gets twisted, right? The structure of the thought, and like lies and doubts and bundling a good idea with a bunch of messed up ideas and then repeating that a bunch of times, and like propaganda, right? And those are the ways of subverting ideas, and that is invisible, but way more far spreading and way harder to eradicate than just reintegrating this member of the community and returning the pixie dust to its full use. Am I criticizing the church? What am I saying here? How does this translate? I don't know. I mean, I was like, I haven't found a community to which I properly belong. I'm happy doing my own thing right now. But I guess certainly, like, yeah, I experienced like a lot of grief leaving my original place, because I was very excited and hopeful that I could be a sort of fruit of that ministry and bloom where I was planted and change things there, but that was simply impossible. But that's been, a separation and like a painful thing, and we both miss out in a sense. But yeah, pixie dust, this movie, very obvious, clear sort of symbolic role that it plays, and a great metaphor for the spirit and the law, and innovation, experimentation, and risk versus, and just what goes wrong when a direct personal contact is lost with the source and it becomes covered by this veil of the law and fear.